The invitation arrived in a cream-colored envelope with gold lettering, and I remember thinking how strange it was that I needed an invitation at all to attend my own granddaughter's graduation party. I was folding laundry when my son called to confirm the time. 6 o'clock, Mom, Marcus said. Country Club, East Lawn. Vanessa wants everyone there early for photos. I told him I wouldn't miss it for anything. I hung up the phone, pressed a crease into Emma's favorite blouse, the one I'd bought her for her 16th birthday, and felt something warm settle in my chest. My granddaughter was graduating high school. In 3 months, she'd be leaving for college. I had been waiting for this day since she was 6 years old, sitting at my kitchen table asking me to help her spell her own name. That afternoon, I spent nearly 2 hours deciding what to wear, laying 3 dresses across my bed before finally settling on the blue one, the same shade Gerald had always said matched my eyes. I curled my hair the way I did for occasions that mattered, wrapped Emma's gift in silver paper, and stood in front of my bedroom mirror for a moment longer than usual, the way you sometimes do before an evening you sense, without being able to say exactly why, might matter more than an ordinary party. I had no idea that by the end of that evening I would be the one leaving the party early, and that within 5 days I would end an arrangement that had quietly supported my son's entire family for 3 years. Nobody at that party knew the arrangement existed. That was exactly the problem. My name is Diane Whitfield. I'm 66 years old. I spent 34 years as a certified public accountant before I retired, the last 12 of those running my own small firm out of a converted garage 2 streets from my house. My husband Gerald died 8 years ago, a heart attack on an ordinary Tuesday morning while he was watering the tomatoes. I still remember the sound the hose made, still running, when the neighbor found him. Grief teaches you things nothing else can. It teaches you how to be alone in a house that used to be full. It also teaches you, eventually, how to build a life again inside that silence. I have 2 children. Lauren, my daughter, is a nurse practitioner who lives 4 hours north with her husband and their twin boys. She calls every Sunday, no matter what. Marcus, my son, is 38, a regional sales director for a medical supply company, married to a woman named Vanessa for 11 years. They have 2 children, Emma, who was about to graduate, and Tyler, who was 14. Gerald and I built the accounting firm together, in a manner of speaking. He never touched a single ledger himself. He was a high school shop teacher for 30 years, steady and unremarkable in the way that steady, unremarkable men become the entire architecture of a family without anyone quite noticing until they're gone. What he did was believe in me before there was much reason to. When I told him at 31 years old with 2 small children at home that I wanted to leave my position at a mid-sized firm downtown and open something of my own, he didn't ask how we'd cover the mortgage. He asked what kind of desk I wanted. That was Gerald. He built the desk himself out of oak in our garage, the same garage that eventually became my office for 12 years. I built that firm slowly, the way most honest things get built, one client at a time, one referral at a time, one tax season surviving into the next. By the time I sold it, I had 4 employees, a reputation in this county for being the accountant people called when something had gone quietly wrong and needed to be quietly fixed, and enough saved, invested carefully and conservatively the way an accountant invests, to retire without financial worry for the rest of my life. Gerald didn't live to see the sale. He died 3 years before I finally let the firm go, and some mornings I still reach for the phone to tell him about a client story before remembering there's no one on the other end of that particular line anymore. Losing him the way I did, no warning, no chance to say anything you'd want your last words to someone to be, changed the shape of how I love people. I became, without entirely meaning to, someone who says the important things while there's still time to say them, and someone who has very little patience left for pretending a wound isn't a wound simply because acknowledging it would be inconvenient for somebody else's evening. My daughter Lauren inherited that same directness, sharpened, if anything, by her years working as a nurse practitioner in a busy emergency department, where politeness has a way of losing its usefulness fairly quickly. She calls every Sunday evening, without fail, usually while she's driving home from her twin boys' soccer practice, and she is the one person in this story who saw the shape of what was happening at Marcus's house long before I was willing to admit it myself. Mom, you do know you're basically funding their entire lifestyle, she said to me once, maybe 18 months before the graduation party during one of those Sunday calls. 28,000 a year for school, 9,000 for the club. That's not helping out, that's carrying them. It's temporary, I told her, the way I'd been telling myself for over a year by then. Mom. Her voice had that particular flatness she used on patients who weren't listening to their own vital signs. It stopped being temporary the day Vanessa joined a country club on your dime. Temporary things don't come with a membership card. I didn't have a good answer for her that night. I changed the subject instead, the way you do when someone you love is right about something you're not ready to face. Vanessa grew up in a family that had money and lost it, which I've come to believe is a very particular kind of wound. She talks about her childhood the way some people talk about a war they survived, always circling back to a lake house that was sold, a country club membership that lapsed, a version of life that ended before she was old enough to understand why. I don't say this to excuse what happened. I say it because understanding where someone's hunger comes from doesn't mean you have to keep feeding it forever. She told me this story once, early in her marriage to Marcus, back when we still spoke easily and often, about the day her family's country club membership had lapsed when she was 12. Her mother had driven her to the club for what Vanessa believed would be an ordinary Saturday swim lesson, only to be told at the front gate that the family's account had been suspended, in full view of the other mothers waiting in the pickup line. I remember standing there in my swimsuit, Vanessa told me, watching my mother's face go completely white, and I promised myself I would never let that happen to my own kids. I would never let anyone see us not belong somewhere. I remember thinking at the time that it was a sad story, worthy of real compassion. I didn't yet understand that she had built an entire adult life around preventing a repeat of that single humiliating afternoon, and that I would eventually become one of the quiet mechanisms keeping that promise alive, invisibly, at my own expense. For most of their marriage, Marcus and Vanessa lived comfortably, but not lavishly. A modest colonial in a good school district, 2 reliable cars, family vacations that involved rental cabins instead of resorts. Then, 3 years ago, everything changed at once. Emma was accepted into Ashworth Academy, a private school 40 minutes from their house, the kind of school where sophomores discuss their college essays over lunch and parents wear blazers to the winter concert. Vanessa had wanted this for years. She called it an investment in Emma's future. Marcus called me the week after the acceptance letter arrived. "Mom," he said, and I could hear the strain in his voice even through the phone. "The tuition is $28,000 a year. We can swing the first semester, but I don't know how we keep this up long term. Vanessa really wants this for Emma." I sat with that phone pressed to my ear for a long moment. I thought about Gerald, about the modest but steady life we'd built, about the firm I'd sold 2 years earlier for a sum that would let me live comfortably for the rest of my days without ever touching the principal if I was careful. I thought, too, about Emma at 6 years old, sitting at my kitchen table, sounding out the letters of her own name with a pencil clutched too tightly in her small fist. I had watched that child grow into someone genuinely curious about the world, someone who read for pleasure and asked real questions at family dinners instead of simply waiting for her turn to talk. A school like Ashworth, I told myself, might simply give her more room to become whoever she was already becoming. "How would it even work?" I asked Marcus. "You said you could cover the first semester." "I could," he said, "but not the second, not without dipping into the emergency fund, and Vanessa's already stressed enough about the move as it is. I hate even asking you this, Mom. I really do." "You're not asking me to fund a lifestyle," I said, more to convince myself than him. "You're asking me to help pay for a good education. Those are different things." "Exactly," Marcus said, relief flooding his voice. "It would just be until I get the promotion I'm up for. 8 months, maybe less. After that, we'll take it over completely, I promise." I sat with that phone pressed to my ear for a long moment. I thought about Gerald, about the modest but steady life we'd built, about the firm I'd sold 2 years earlier for a sum that would let me live comfortably for the rest of my days without ever touching the principal if I was careful. "I can help," I told him. "Not forever, but I can help." The promotion came through 4 months later, and with it, a raise substantial enough that I assumed reasonably the arrangement would begin winding down on its own. Instead, the raise seemed to expand what the household considered necessary rather than closing the gap it had created. A newer car appeared in the driveway within weeks of the raise clearing. A kitchen renovation followed the year after that. I never said anything about either purchase. I told myself again that it wasn't my business how they spent Marcus's own income, even as the tuition and the country club dues continued arriving from my account every August and every January, untouched by any of it. What started as help with one semester became, quietly and without anyone ever renegotiating the terms out loud, a standing arrangement. Every August and every January, I transferred the tuition directly to Ashworth Academy's business office, not to Marcus, not to Vanessa, directly to the school, so there would never be a question of where the money actually went. A year into that arrangement, Vanessa joined Cedar Hollow Country Club, the same club Emma's new school friends belonged to. $9,000 a year in dues, she explained to Marcus, was simply the cost of Emma having a normal social life among her new classmates. I paid that too, directly to the club's billing office, quietly, the same way. I want to be clear about something. I never once regretted a single payment. I loved watching Emma flourish at that school. I loved seeing photos of her at the club pool with friends, laughing in a way she hadn't laughed before. What I minded, what slowly began working on something inside me, like water working on stone, was what came after the money. The first time I noticed it, we were at Emma's 15th birthday dinner, 8 months into the new arrangement. Vanessa was telling a table of her club friends about the school, about the tuition, about how she and Marcus had sacrificed so much to give Emma this opportunity. One of the women asked how they managed it on a sales director's salary. Vanessa laughed, waved her hand, and said, "You just prioritize what matters. We cut back everywhere else." Nobody at that table knew my name was on the check that made all of it possible. I told myself it didn't matter. Credit isn't the same as gratitude, I reasoned, and gratitude was really what I wanted. Short pause. The second incident came about a year later, at a smaller gathering, a Sunday dinner at Marcus and Vanessa's house. I'd brought a casserole, the way I always did, homemade, in the same dish I'd been using since Marcus was in grade school. Vanessa took one look at it on the counter and said lightly, almost as a joke, "Diane, you know we could just order in. You don't have to keep bringing these old dishes." She smiled when she said it. Marcus laughed. I laughed too, because that's what you do, and I told myself she meant no harm by it. But something had shifted. It wasn't about the casserole. It was about the word old. It was about the fact that in the 18 months since Ashworth Academy had entered our lives, Vanessa had started referring to things in my world, my cooking, my sedan, my modest wardrobe, as if they belonged to a category she and her family had graduated out of, a category that I, apparently, had not. The third incident happened at Tyler's 8th grade honor roll dinner, held at a steakhouse Vanessa had chosen specifically because, she mentioned twice, several Ashworth families would recognize it from a similar chain near the club. I arrived a few minutes late after a doctor's appointment ran long, and by the time I sat down, the table had already ordered a round of appetizers. Vanessa glanced at the menu in my hands and said, pleasantly enough, "Diane, don't feel like you need to order the expensive plates just because we're celebrating. Get whatever's comfortable for you." Nobody at that table understood, because I had never told a single one of them that I had by that point transferred over $60,000 toward their daughter's education and their family's club dues over the previous 2 years alone. I ordered the salmon. I said nothing. I told myself again that she simply didn't know any better, though some quiet part of me had begun to suspect she knew exactly what she was doing and had simply calculated correctly that I would let it pass. The fourth incident took place at a spring fundraiser for Ashworth Academy itself, an evening I had actually paid the ticket price to attend at Vanessa's invitation so that I could finally see in person the school I had been supporting from a distance for 2 years. The auction hall had been decorated with the same practiced elegance I'd noticed at every Ashworth event: chandeliers, string quartet, a silent auction table stacked with donated vacations and vineyard tours. Vanessa moved through the crowd that evening like a woman entirely in her element, laughing at the right moments, touching elbows at the right moments, a version of herself I only ever saw at events like this one. She introduced me that night to the school's head of development, a tall, silver-haired man named Bertram Coyle, as Marcus's mother, who's always been such a wonderful help around the house. Mr. Coyle shook my hand warmly and said, "How lovely! It really does take a village, doesn't it?" I smiled and agreed that it did, though the word village felt oddly small for what I had actually been carrying. He moved on to the next family a moment later, already forgetting my name, and I stood there for a moment amid the chandeliers and the string quartet, holding a glass of wine I hadn't touched, feeling entirely invisible in a room I had, in a very literal sense, helped build. Around the house, 2 years and roughly $60,000 reduced in a single sentence to help around the house, as though I had perhaps folded some laundry or picked Emma up from soccer practice on occasion. I shook Mr. Coyle's hand, smiled, and said nothing, though that particular phrase stayed lodged in my chest for weeks afterward, the way a small stone in a shoe eventually makes itself impossible to ignore no matter how many times you tell yourself it's fine to keep walking. I called Lauren that same week, and for the first time I told her the whole truth of it, every incident, in order, the way I might lay out evidence for a client's audit. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "Mom," she finally said, "you've been letting yourself get smaller for 2 years so that Vanessa can feel bigger. That's not generosity anymore. That's just a slow kind of disappearing." I didn't have an answer for that either. I only knew that some part of me had started keeping score quietly, the way I once kept score of billable hours, and that the number had grown larger than I was comfortable admitting even to myself. The fifth incident happened at Cedar Hollow itself, on one of the rare occasions Vanessa invited me to join them at the club pool on a Saturday afternoon. I arrived in a modest one-piece swimsuit and a cotton cover-up, feeling perfectly comfortable until Vanessa met me at the gate and looked me over with an expression I recognized instantly, the same one she'd worn over the casserole dish years earlier. "You look nice," she said, in a tone that suggested the opposite. "Very practical." She introduced me to two women lounging under a striped umbrella as Marcus's mother. She's not really a pool person, but we like to include her when we can. Not really a pool person. I had swum every summer of my adult life. I sat under a smaller umbrella at the edge of the deck for 2 hours, watching Vanessa laugh loudly with women whose club dues I was at that very moment funding. And I told myself one more time that it wasn't worth making a scene over. The sixth incident is the one I think about most because it's the one where I should have said something and didn't. It was at Emma's junior year winter concert held at the school's auditorium, all dark wood paneling and stained glass. Afterward in the lobby, Vanessa introduced me to a cluster of other Ashworth parents. "This is Marcus's mother," she said, gesturing toward me with her wine glass. Then, after the smallest pause, she added, "She's from out of town. I have lived 22 minutes from that school for the entire time it had existed." I said nothing. I smiled and shook hands and let the moment pass, the way you let a splinter sit under the skin because digging it out seems like more trouble than it's worth. I didn't understand yet that splinters left alone don't disappear. They work their way deeper. By the time Emma's senior year began, the pattern had become something I could set my watch to. Every family gathering carried a small, deniable cruelty, wrapped in a joke or a compliment that wasn't quite one. Vanessa began describing herself, to anyone who would listen, as a woman who had built a beautiful life for her children through sheer determination. She said it at Emma's college tour send-off. She said it at Tyler's middle school honor roll dinner. Marcus never corrected her. I began to understand that Marcus's silence wasn't cruelty. It was cowardice, which somehow hurt more because cruelty at least requires you to look someone in the eye. I want to tell you that I confronted this early, that I was the kind of woman who draws a firm line the moment she's disrespected. I wasn't. I told myself 100 different stories to avoid dealing with the truth. She's stressed. She grew up without much, and she's scared of losing it again. She doesn't realize how it sounds. Marcus loves me even if he doesn't say it out loud. I believed every one of those stories, some days more than others, because believing them was easier than accepting that the family I had spent 3 years quietly funding had begun to treat my presence as an inconvenience they tolerated rather than a gift they valued. There was one evening, about a month before the graduation party, when I came close to saying something. Vanessa had called to ask whether I could chip in a little extra toward a graduation photographer on top of everything else, since the one Emma's friends were using was, in her words, the one everyone who matters is booking. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment, feeling something rise up in me that felt very close to the surface, very close to finally saying out loud everything I'd swallowed for 3 years. I opened my mouth to say something about how tired I was of being asked for more while being treated like less. Then I thought about Emma, about her excitement over the milestone, about how a fight over a photographer bill would only ever land on her, not on Vanessa. I said yes instead, transferred the additional amount, and told myself one more time that the moment to say something hadn't quite arrived yet. Looking back, I understand now that I was wrong about that. The moment had arrived months earlier. I simply hadn't been ready to stand inside it yet. Then came the graduation party. Cedar Hollow Country Club's east lawn had been transformed for the occasion. White string lights wound through the trees. A catering staff in black vests circulated with trays of past appetizers. A photographer Vanessa had hired moved through the crowd, capturing candid shots for what she'd already told several people would become a beautiful photo book to remember this chapter. There were perhaps 60 guests, Emma's classmates, Marcus's co-workers, a dozen or so of Vanessa's club friends, women in linen dresses and men in pastel polos, the kind of crowd that photographs beautifully and says very little of substance. I arrived at 6:15, wearing the blue dress Gerald had always liked, my hair freshly done, carrying a wrapped gift for Emma, a leather-bound journal, and a card with more money in it than I usually gave, because 18 was a milestone and I wanted her to know it. Marcus met me near the entrance and hugged me tightly. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said, and for a moment, standing there with my son's arms around me, I believed the evening would be exactly what it should have been. Emma found me 20 minutes later, glowing in a white sundress, and threw her arms around my neck the way she used to when she was small enough for me to lift. "Grandma, I'm so glad you're here," she said. That at least was real. Whatever went wrong that night, it never touched what Emma and I had built between us. Vanessa greeted me at the edge of the dessert table, a glass of champagne already in her hand, her dress the pale gold color of the string lights above us. "Diane," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek, "so glad you made it out." Made it out, as though I lived some meaningful distance away rather than 22 minutes down the same county road she drove every single day. "The Hendersons are here, and the Averys. You remember them from the winter concert." I didn't remember them because I had met them exactly once, for perhaps 90 seconds, at an event Vanessa herself had introduced me at as someone from out of town. I smiled and said it was lovely to see everyone. For the first hour, the evening was, in fact, lovely. I sat with Marcus's co-workers who were kind and asked genuine questions about my years running the firm. One of them mentioning that his own mother had been an accountant and understood exactly the kind of discipline it required. I watched Emma move through the crowd of her classmates, laughing, glowing, entirely herself. I watched Tyler, 14 and gangly and bored the way 14-year-olds are always bored at their sister's parties, sneak a second plate of appetizers when he thought no one was looking. I caught his eye and winked, and he grinned back at me, and for a little while I let myself believe the whole evening might simply pass the way ordinary evenings do, without incident, without consequence, without anyone standing up to say something they couldn't take back. Dinner was served on the east lawn under the string lights, long tables draped in white linen, and I found myself seated between Marcus's co-worker's wife and one of Vanessa's club friends, a woman named Priscilla, who spent most of the meal describing a recent trip to the Amalfi Coast in a level of detail that made me suspect she had described it several times already that week to several other people. I nodded along, ate my dinner, and watched Vanessa across the table, laughing loudly at something one of the other club wives had said, her wine glass never quite empty for long. The toasts began around 7:30, after dinner had been cleared and the light had turned the particular gold that only happens right before sunset. Marcus went first, a warm, if slightly rehearsed speech about his daughter's hard work and bright future, thanking teachers, thanking friends, thanking Vanessa for building the kind of home where Emma could become exactly who she was meant to be. He didn't mention me at all, not once, though I told myself that was simply an oversight, the way I had told myself so many things over the previous 3 years. Vanessa stood next, and something in the way she rose, unhurried, glass already lifted before she'd said a word, told me this particular toast had been rehearsed more carefully than Marcus's had. She tapped her glass with a fork until the lawn quieted, the string lights flickering slightly overhead as the last of the sunset caught the crystal in her hand. She smiled the smile I had come to recognize as the one she used right before she said something designed to hurt, bright and warm on the surface, something colder moving underneath it. Suspenseful. "I just want to say," she began, her eyes moving across the crowd, lingering deliberately on certain faces, the club friends, the Ashworth parents, the people whose opinion of her mattered more than anyone else's in that yard. "How grateful I am for the family that helped build this life for Emma, the family who understands what it means to show up looking the part, to fit into rooms like this one." She gestured, almost casually, at the tents, the string lights, the linen-dressed crowd around her, and several people murmured appreciatively, raising their own glasses in anticipation of the toast's conclusion. Then her eyes landed on me, and something in her expression sharpened, the warmth draining out of it in an instant. "And I think we should also raise a glass," she continued, her voice never once losing its pleasant party-appropriate lilt, "to the family members who never quite figure out how to dress for the photos. Who show up, bless them, but who maybe don't really belong in this particular picture." For a moment nobody moved. Then a ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, uncertain at first, then bolder as people realized she meant it as a joke and decided it was safe to laugh. Someone near the back said, loud enough to carry, "Oh, Vanessa, you're terrible," in the tone people use when they don't actually think someone is being terrible at all. Priscilla, seated 2 tables over, laughed loudest of anyone, her wineglass tipping precariously in her hand. I looked at Marcus. He was staring at his plate, his jaw tight, his hands folded in his lap. He said nothing. He did nothing. In 11 years of marriage, I had watched my son learn to go very still whenever his wife needed an audience more than she needed a husband. I felt in that moment something settle inside me that had been unsettled for a very long time, a kind of quiet, final understanding that no rescue was coming from that direction, and that it never really had been. I looked at Emma. She wasn't laughing. Her face had gone pale, her eyes flicking between her mother and me with something like horror, her fork frozen halfway to her plate. I stood up slowly. The lawn quieted the way a room quiets when it senses something is about to happen that it hasn't fully decided how to feel about yet. I lifted my own glass, still full, the ice barely melted. "Since we're making toasts," I said, and my voice came out calmer than I expected it to, calmer than I felt, "I'd like to make one too. To the family," I continued, "who is about to learn exactly what an Ashworth Academy education actually costs, and what a country club membership costs, because I don't think everyone at this table has done that math." The silence that followed was the kind you could have poured into a glass and served alongside the champagne. Vanessa's smile didn't fall so much as it simply stopped existing, replaced by something rigid and uncertain. Marcus looked at me the way you look at a stranger who has just spoken a language you don't recognize. "Mom," he said quietly, "what are you talking about?" I didn't answer him, not there, not in front of 60 people who had just laughed at a joke about where I belonged. I set my glass down on the white tablecloth, gently, the way you set down something you don't intend to pick back up. I walked to Emma first, kissed the top of her head, told her I loved her and that I was proud of her, and that nothing about tonight changed that. Then I picked up my purse and walked across the lawn toward the parking lot, past the string lights, past the photographer who lowered his camera slightly as I passed, past 60 faces that had gone very quiet, very fast. Nobody followed me. Nobody apologized. I drove home with the windows down, the summer air moving through the car, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not rage. Something quieter and colder than that. Clarity. Emma told me weeks later what happened on that lawn after I'd gone, pieced together from things she'd overheard and things Tyler had described to her afterward. Apparently the party had gone very quiet for several minutes, the string lights still glowing over a crowd that didn't quite know what to do with itself. Marcus had finally turned to Vanessa, in front of whoever was still close enough to hear, and asked her in a voice Emma described as flatter than she'd ever heard from her father what exactly she thought she'd just done. Vanessa had tried to laugh it off, telling him I was being dramatic, that it was just a joke, and Marcus, for the first time in as long as Emma could remember, hadn't laughed along or gone quiet. He'd simply said, "She just paid for the tuition of nearly every kid at this party's school, Vanessa. I don't think you understand what you just lit on fire." Then he'd walked toward the parking lot himself, Emma said, though by the time he got there my car was already gone. Somewhere along that dark county road, I thought about the first year after Gerald died, the year I learned, slowly and without much grace, how to be a whole person again inside a life that had suddenly halved itself. I remembered sitting at that same kitchen table with a stack of bills I'd never had to think about before, because Gerald had always handled the insurance, the property taxes, the small ordinary decisions of running a household, while I ran the firm. I remembered the particular loneliness of learning to make every decision alone, and the strange, hard-won pride that came afterward when I realized I could. Widowhood teaches you, whether you want the lesson or not, that you are more capable of standing on your own than you ever gave yourself credit for while someone else was standing beside you. I think some part of me had simply forgotten that lesson somewhere in the last 3 years, quietly handing my own dignity over to a family that had stopped noticing it was a gift rather than a given. Driving home from that party, I felt that old, hard-won capability rising back up in me. The same steadiness that had carried me through those first impossible months alone, and I understood with total clarity exactly what I was going to do before I even reached my own driveway. For 3 years, I had carried an arrangement that not one person at that party understood existed. I had paid for the dress code Vanessa mocked me for failing to meet. I had paid for the very lawn she stood on to humiliate me. I thought about that the whole drive home, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, I already knew, with a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years, exactly what I was going to do. Short pause. I still remember what happened next. Inside my house, I made a cup of chamomile tea and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Marcus used to do his homework, where Anna had once asked me to help her spell her own name. I opened my laptop. I pulled up the folder where I kept records of every payment I'd made to Ashworth Academy and to Cedar Hollow Country Club for 3 years, meticulous the way only a retired accountant's records can be. 34 years of habit doesn't disappear just because you've stopped billing hours. The next tuition installment, the deposit for Emma's final semester, wasn't due for 5 more days. The country club's annual membership renewal, coincidentally, was due on the same date. I had set both up as manual transfers rather than automatic ones years earlier, out of habit, the same caution I'd have applied to any client's account. I had never signed a contract with either institution. There was no binding obligation anywhere with my name on it. Legally, I owed neither of them a single additional dollar. I never had. Every payment had been a gift given freely, and every gift given freely can be freely stopped. I sat with that fact for a long time, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath. Part of me wanted to call Marcus first, to give him the chance to fix this himself, to stand up for me the way I had waited 11 years for him to stand up for me. But some quiet accountant's part of my mind reminded me that I had given him that chance 100 times already, at 100 smaller moments, and he had failed to take it every single time. Warnings only work on people who are listening for them. Marcus had trained himself, carefully and probably without meaning to, not to hear anything that might require him to disagree with his wife in public. I thought about calling Lauren instead, just to hear her voice before I did anything permanent. I decided against it. This wasn't a decision I needed anyone else's permission for, and some part of me understood that if I called her first, some of what happened next would belong to her advice rather than my own resolve. I wanted this to be entirely mine. I thought about Emma, asleep by now in her childhood bedroom, unaware that her grandmother was sitting 15 minutes away, deciding the shape of her final semester of high school. I thought about the leather journal I'd given her that night, still wrapped in its silver paper on the passenger seat of my car, because I'd never gotten the chance to give it to her properly before I left. I thought about the 6 acres of my own quiet resolve, built the same slow way Gerald and I had built everything worth having, one deliberate decision at a time, never in a hurry, never undone by anyone else's comfort. I thought, too, about the word Vanessa had used in front of 60 people. Belong. As though belonging were a thing you earned through the right dress, the right posture, the right silence at the right moments, rather than something a family simply owes the people who show up for it, year after year, check after check, casserole after casserole. I had spent 3 years trying to earn a kind of belonging that should never have required earning in the first place. That, more than any single joke at that party, was the thing I finally understood sitting at my kitchen table that night. Then I opened a new email to the business office at Ashworth Academy. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do because I think it matters. I did not call the school to complain about Vanessa. I did not mention the party at all. I simply wrote, in the calm, precise language of 34 years spent writing to clients, that I would no longer be the party responsible for Emma's tuition payments effective immediately, and that any future billing should be directed to her parents, Marcus and Vanessa Whitfield, whose contact information I provided. I sent an identical letter to the membership office at Cedar Hollow Country Club regarding the annual renewal. Then I closed my laptop, finished my tea, and went outside to water the flowers Gerald had planted along the back fence years ago. The evening air had cooled. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and went quiet. I remember thinking that the world looked exactly the same as it had that morning, and that tomorrow, for 2 people across town, it wouldn't look the same at all. I want to say clearly that I never once considered pulling Emma out of anything against her will, or punishing her for choices that were never hers to make. That thought would come later, and it would matter more than almost anything else in this story. But that night, sitting alone in my kitchen with a stack of 3 years of receipts in front of me, I wasn't thinking about solutions yet. I was simply done financing a life I had been mocked for not belonging inside of. I went to bed around 11. I slept better than I had in months. Saturday morning arrived quietly, birds in the yard, coffee brewing, the ordinary rhythm of a life that had for one night felt entirely unlike itself. I was on my second cup when my phone began vibrating on the counter. Marcus. I let it ring. A minute later it rang again. I let that one go too. By 9:30, I had 4 missed calls from Marcus and 2 from Vanessa, along with a text message that read simply, "Mom, we need to talk. Please call." I didn't call, not yet. I had learned, over 3 years of being treated as a footnote in my own family's story, that some conversations only become honest once the other person has had time to feel the full weight of what's actually happening. I let Saturday pass in something close to peace. I worked in the garden. I had lunch with a friend. I did not check my phone more than twice. I did call Lauren that afternoon, though, sitting on my back porch with a glass of iced tea while Marcus's missed calls stacked up unanswered on the counter inside. She listened to the entire story, the toast, the walk across the lawn, the letters to the school and the club, without interrupting once, which for Lauren was itself a kind of miracle. "Mom," she finally said, and I could hear something thick in her voice. "I've been waiting 2 years for you to do exactly this." "I know," I said. "You told me so, more than once." "I'm not saying that to gloat," she said quickly. "I'm saying it because I need you to know you're not crazy and you're not being cruel. You're finally doing the thing you should have done the first time she called you out of town in front of strangers." "Marcus keeps calling," I told her. "He sounds frantic." Let him sound frantic for a day, Lauren said. Frantic is what happens when a safety net disappears out from under someone who forgot it was ever a net at all, instead of just the floor. He'll be fine, Mom. Emma will be fine. The only person in that family who's ever actually suffered for 3 years is you, and nobody noticed because you never let them see it. I sat with that for a long moment, watching the late afternoon light move across the yard. When did you get so wise? I asked her, half joking. Emergency room, she said. You watch enough families fall apart over money and pride. You start to see the pattern early. This was never really about a joke at a party, Mom. That joke was just the moment the pattern finally became visible enough for you to act on it. I thought about that phrase for the rest of the weekend. The pattern finally became visible enough to act on. It felt true in a way that settled something in my chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. By Sunday afternoon, the calls had changed in character. I could hear it even in the voicemails, the tone shifting from confusion to something closer to alarm. Mom, the school called, Marcus said in one message, his voice tight. They said tuition needs to come from us starting now, and there's a deposit due Wednesday we don't have. Please call me back. Another message, an hour later, from Vanessa herself, her voice clipped and cold. Diane, I don't know what kind of point you're trying to make, but this isn't fair to Emma. Call Marcus back. I noticed something in that message. Not fair to Emma. As if fairness to Emma hadn't been my concern for 3 years running. As if I hadn't been the one quietly making sure Emma never had to think about any of this at all. I called Marcus back that evening. Mom, thank God, he said, and I could hear real relief in his voice, followed almost immediately by confusion. What happened? The school said you canceled the tuition. The club said the same thing. Did we do something wrong with the account? No, I said. I canceled it myself, on purpose. There was a long pause. Why would you do that? Emma has a deposit due Wednesday. We don't have $28,000 sitting around, Mom. You know that. I know, I said, and I kept my voice even, the way I used to when explaining a difficult audit finding to a client who didn't want to hear it. I've known that for 3 years, Marcus. That's why I've been paying it. Another pause. Longer this time. Okay. I don't understand what changed. What changed, I said, is that on Friday night, in front of 60 people, your wife made a joke about the family who doesn't belong in the photographs, and you sat there and said nothing. I have been paying for that lawn, Marcus. I have been paying for the dress code she implied I failed to meet, and not one person at that party, including you, knew that. I think it's time everyone found out. I heard him exhale slowly on the other end. Mom, Vanessa didn't mean anything by that. It was just a joke. She was... I know what it was, I said. I was standing right there. He didn't have an answer for that. A few seconds later, I heard Vanessa's voice in the background, sharp, asking who he was talking to, and then the sound of the phone being taken. Diane! Vanessa's voice clipped. This is incredibly childish. You're punishing an 18-year-old girl over a joke that got a little out of hand. Is that really who you are? No, I said quietly. I'm the woman who paid for that girl's education for 3 years without asking for a single thank you, and who was mocked for it at her own graduation party by the person who benefited most. I think the question is who you are, Vanessa. You're being dramatic. I'm being accurate, I said. There's a difference. I've spent 34 years learning to know it. She hung up on me. I sat with the dial tone for a moment, then set the phone down and finished making my dinner. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt tired and sad and something else underneath both of those things that I recognized eventually as relief. Frustration. I saw my friend Margaret for coffee the next morning the way we did most weeks, and she listened to the entire story without interrupting, her cup going cold in front of her. Margaret and I had known each other since our children were in elementary school together, long before either of us had any idea our lives would eventually run in such different directions. Hers toward a quiet retirement with a husband still very much alive, mine toward widowhood and a business I'd built largely on my own. Diane, she finally said, "I've watched you write checks to that family for 3 years and listened to you make excuses for it every single time I asked why you never mentioned it to anyone. I'm not going to pretend I'm surprised it finally caught up with everyone at once. I'm only sorry it took a room full of strangers laughing at you to get here." "I know," I said. "I keep waiting to feel guilty about it, and it isn't coming." "Maybe it isn't coming," Margaret said, "because there's nothing here to feel guilty about. You didn't abandon anyone. You stopped subsidizing your own disrespect. Those aren't the same thing, no matter how Vanessa wants to frame it." I turned my coffee cup slowly in my hands. "Marcus keeps asking if I'll turn the payments back on. And what are you going to tell him?" "That I already have an answer, and it isn't the one he's hoping for." Margaret smiled, the particular smile of an old friend who has been waiting years to see you finally choose yourself. "Good," she said simply. "It's about time somebody in that family learned what things actually cost." Monday brought a different kind of pressure. Marcus called during his lunch break, his voice lower, more measured, the way a man sounds when he's trying to solve a problem rather than defend one. "Mom, I talked to the school. They said there's a grace period, but we need to figure out the money by Wednesday or Emma loses her spot for senior year. I don't know what to do. Vanessa's talking about pulling her out and putting her in public school for the last semester, which would devastate her, especially now, right before college applications." "That's a real consequence," I said. "I understand that. I'm not going to pretend it isn't." "So you'll help? You'll turn the payments back on?" I sat with that question for a long moment. This was the part where the story could have gone in an easier direction, the direction where I simply resumed the arrangement once everyone apologized enough, where 3 years of a familiar pattern resumed its shape and nothing actually changed beneath the surface. I had come very close, in the quiet of my kitchen the night before, to choosing that direction. "No," I said finally, "I'm not turning the payments back on for you and Vanessa. That arrangement is over. It's been over since Friday night. Mom, please—" "But," I continued, "I want to talk to Emma directly. Not through you, not through Vanessa. If she wants to finish her senior year at Ashworth, I'll pay her tuition myself directly to the school in her name on one condition. Nobody else's name goes anywhere near that arrangement. Not yours, not Vanessa's. This is between me and my granddaughter, and it will stay that way." Marcus was quiet for a long time. "You'd do that? Even after everything?" "Emma didn't stand up at that party and make a joke about where I belong," I said. "Emma hugged me and told me she was glad I came. I'm not interested in punishing an 18-year-old for her mother's cruelty, but I am finished being an invisible line item in a lifestyle I was mocked for financing." I could hear something shift in his voice, something that sounded for the first time in a long while like actual understanding rather than negotiation. "That's fair," he said quietly. "That's more than fair." Emma called me herself that evening. She'd clearly been crying. "Grandma," she said, "is it true? Are you really not paying for school anymore?" "Not for your parents' arrangement, no," I said gently. "But I want to talk to you about something if you're willing to listen." I explained what I'd told Marcus, that I would fund her final semester myself, directly, in her name, no strings attached to anyone else in the house. That this had nothing to do with her and everything to do with a pattern I had finally decided to stop participating in. There was a long silence on the line, and then Emma said something that stayed with me longer than almost anything else that happened that week. "Grandma, I didn't know it was you this whole time. Mom always said Dad's promotion covered it. I feel sick knowing you paid for all of it, and she made fun of you for it at my own party." "You don't need to feel sick," I told her. "You didn't do anything wrong. This isn't about you paying me back or feeling guilty. It's about me finally saying out loud what I should have said quietly a long time ago." "I'm so sorry, Grandma," she said, and I could hear she meant it completely. "I know you are, sweetheart," I said. "That's exactly why this offer is for you, and only you." Before I finalized the new arrangement, Bertram Cole himself called me directly, the same silver-haired development officer who had once described me, through Vanessa, as help around the house. His tone on the phone was warm, practiced, the voice of a man accustomed to smoothing over the discomfort of wealthy families. "Mrs. Whitfield, I understand there may have been some confusion regarding the tuition account. I want you to know how much Ashworth values the Whitfield family's presence in our community. Is there anything we can do to make this easier? There's nothing confusing about it, Mr. Coyle, I said. I'm simply redirecting the payment to be made in my granddaughter's name specifically rather than as a general household contribution. The funds will still arrive. The instructions are just more precise now. Of course, he said quickly. We do so appreciate benefactors like yourself. Families like the Whitfields are the backbone of what we do here. I found something almost funny in that phrase, benefactors like yourself, delivered by a man who had less than a year earlier shaken my hand while being introduced to me as somebody's household help. I appreciate that, Mr. Coyle, I said, though I'll admit it's interesting how quickly a benefactor becomes visible the moment a payment might actually stop. There was a brief, uncomfortable pause on his end. I understand there may have been a miscommunication about your role within the family, Mrs. Whitfield. I assure you, the school values every family who invests in a student's future, regardless of how that investment is described socially. I appreciate the honesty, I said, and I meant it, oddly enough. It was the first time anyone connected to that world had actually acknowledged out loud that the description of my role had been a choice someone made, not simply an oversight. We finished the call cordially. The new arrangement went through exactly as I'd specified. By Wednesday, the deposit for Emma's tuition arrived at Ashworth Academy under my name, addressed specifically to cover Emma Whitfield's final semester, with explicit written instruction that all future correspondence regarding this particular payment go through me directly. The country club membership, however, I let lapse entirely. That decision had nothing to do with Emma. It had everything to do with Vanessa, and I felt no need to soften it. Cold. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, uneven rhythm across two households. In mine, life continued almost exactly as it always had. Mornings in the garden, afternoons with friends, evenings reading on the porch with a cup of tea. In theirs, according to Emma, things looked considerably different. She told me the family began eating at home more, groceries instead of restaurant takeout, and that her mother had started clipping coupons from the Sunday paper, a habit Emma had never once seen her practice in 17 years. Marcus canceled a golf league he'd belonged to for years, quietly, without complaint, redirecting that small monthly cost toward the gap the club dues had left behind. Tyler's summer camp, a modest day program he'd attended for years, continued without interruption, since it had never been part of the arrangement I'd funded in the first place, and I noticed, without saying anything, that he seemed just as happy there as he always had. Further proof, if any were needed, of how much of what Vanessa considered essential had never actually been necessary at all. The fallout inside that house, I learned later, mostly through Emma and eventually through Marcus himself, was significant. Vanessa was furious about the country club, humiliated in front of her own social circle when the membership quietly expired and her friends began asking questions she had no good answer for. She had built an entire identity around Cedar Hollow, around the version of herself that belonged there, and losing it publicly cut in a way that I suspect no argument with me ever could have. Emma told me later that the club's front office had called the house directly in front of Vanessa to confirm the cancellation, and that Priscilla, the same woman who had spent an entire dinner describing the Amalfi Coast to me, texted Vanessa within the hour asking if everything was all right, in that particular tone people use when they already suspect it isn't. By the following week, according to Emma, 2 more of Vanessa's club friends had quietly stopped including her in their weekend plans. Mom's been sitting by herself at pickup, Emma told me, not unkindly, just factually, the way teenagers report the world back to you sometimes with more honesty than adults manage. I think she thought those women actually liked her. Tyler, 14 and mostly uninterested in the politics of his mother's social circle, had his own reaction, delivered to me over ice cream a few weeks later with the blunt clarity only a 14-year-old can manage. Honestly, Grandma, he said, licking his cone, I never really liked going to that club anyway. Everybody's parents talked about their houses the whole time. I like it better when it's just us. I laughed harder at that than I had in weeks and told him he'd understood something it had taken his own mother considerably longer to learn. Emma had her own version of the fallout to navigate, one considerably more delicate than her brother's, since word of the cancelled tuition had inevitably made its way through Ashworth's small, tightly wound social circle by the time school resumed for her final semester. She told me about it over the phone one evening, her voice steady in a way that told me she'd already decided how she wanted to handle it before she ever mentioned it to me. Some of the girls asked if it was true that my grandmother had been paying for everything this whole time, she said. I told them yes. I told them you'd been quietly funding my education for 3 years while my mother introduced you as help around the house, and that you finally decided you were done being treated that way. A couple of them got weird about it. Most of them just thought it was kind of amazing, honestly. You didn't have to tell anyone anything, I said gently. I wanted to, Emma said. I spent 3 years thinking my parents had built this whole life themselves. Finding out it was you the entire time didn't embarrass me, Grandma. It made me proud of you. I didn't see why I should hide that just because it might make my mom uncomfortable. I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up, struck by how easily an 18-year-old had arrived at a clarity it had taken me 3 years, and one very public humiliation to reach myself. Pride, I thought, was supposed to travel down through a family the way money did, quietly, generation to generation. It had taken Emma considerably less time to understand where hers actually belonged. Marcus told me 3 weeks later, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, that the fight that followed was the worst of their marriage. She kept saying you'd humiliated her, he said. I finally told her the truth. I said, Vanessa, you humiliated my mother first, in front of 60 people, after she paid for the ground you were standing on. I should have said that at the party. I've been trying to figure out for weeks why I didn't. Why didn't you? I asked, and I meant it as a real question, not an accusation. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. Because it was easier to let you absorb it than to make her upset with me, he said finally. I've been doing that for years, Mom. Letting you take the hit so I wouldn't have to have a hard conversation at home. I didn't want to see it that way, but that's exactly what it was. I didn't say anything. I let that sit in the room between us because I think some truths need silence around them to be fully heard, by the person saying them as much as the person receiving them. I'm sorry, he said. I should have stood up that night. I should have stood up 100 nights before that one. Yes, I said, you should have. I didn't tell him it was fine. It wasn't entirely, not yet. But I also didn't shut the door on him because underneath 11 years of silence, I could still see the boy who used to sit at that same table asking me to check his math homework, genuinely wanting to get it right. Marcus came by my house alone one evening in mid-June, without calling first, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager sneaking in past curfew. He looked tired, his tie loosened, his collar unbuttoned, standing on my porch like a man who'd rehearsed what he wanted to say the entire drive over and lost his nerve somewhere around my front steps. Can I sit for a minute? He asked. We sat on the porch swing Gerald had hung for me the summer before he died. And for a long moment Marcus said nothing at all, just stared out at the yard the way he used to when he was 15 and had done something he wasn't sure how to confess. I keep thinking about that toast, he finally said. Not just what Vanessa said, what I didn't say. I had 10 seconds, Mom, 10 seconds to stand up and say that's not okay. And I let them pass because I was scared of what she'd say to me later if I embarrassed her in front of her friends. I chose her comfort over your dignity, and I didn't even have to think about it. That's the part that scares me most. It wasn't even a hard decision for me. It was just automatic. I noticed, I said quietly. I know you did, he said. I've been trying to figure out when that became automatic. I don't think it happened all at once. I think it was 100 small moments starting probably around the time Ashworth came into our lives, where I learned that keeping Vanessa calm mattered more than keeping things fair. And somewhere in there, you became the person I let absorb the unfairness because you never fought back, and she always did. I let that sit between us for a moment before answering. You're not wrong, I said, but I want you to hear something else too. I let you learn that lesson, Marcus. I taught it to you just as much as you learned it every time I smiled through something that should have made me furious. We built that pattern together. You're not the only one who needs to change how he behaves. He nodded slowly, his eyes wet in the porch light. I don't know how to fix 11 years of that in one conversation. You don't, I said. You fix it the same way you'd fix any other bad habit. Slowly and out loud, every single time it comes up again. In the middle of that same June, Marcus asked if I'd be willing to join a video call with him and Vanessa together, something he described a little awkwardly as trying to get everyone on the same page. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity about what that page might actually contain. When the call connected, Marcus was sitting at his kitchen island, and Vanessa stood behind him, arms crossed, her expression carefully arranged into something between contrition and defensiveness. "Mom," Marcus began, "we wanted to talk through everything as a family, get on the same page about what happens next." "I'm listening," I said. Vanessa spoke first, her voice tighter than I'd heard it in years. "I think we all said things in the heat of the moment. I know the joke landed wrong, but canceling both payments at once with no warning felt like it was designed to hurt us as much as possible. Was that the intention?" I considered the question honestly before answering. "The intention was to stop paying for a life I was being mocked for financing," I said. "If it hurt, I understand that. It should. 3 years of quiet contributions don't disappear painlessly just because the reason they're ending is a good one." "We could lose the house," Vanessa said suddenly, her composure cracking slightly. "Not literally, but the way things are set up. If we can't recover from this financially, everything unravels. Is that really what you wanted?" "What I wanted," I said, "was to stop being introduced as help around the house while paying for the house you were standing in. I never once asked either of you to build a life you couldn't afford. I only asked eventually, silently, and apparently not loudly enough, to be treated like family instead of a footnote." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and then he turned slightly toward Vanessa, away from the camera, in a way that suggested he'd forgotten, briefly, that I could still see them both. "She's right," he said to her, quietly but clearly enough for me to hear. "We built something we couldn't actually afford, and we let my mother carry it so we wouldn't have to admit that to each other." Vanessa's eyes filled, and for the first time in the entire call, she didn't have a rebuttal ready. "I don't know how to fix a marriage that was built partly on somebody else's money," she said, almost to herself. "That's not really my problem to solve," I told her gently. "But I'll say this. A marriage built on somebody else's silent sacrifice was never actually standing on its own foundation to begin with. If it collapses now, it's not because I pulled something out from under it. It's because it was never really there in the first place." Nobody spoke for a long moment after that. Marcus finally looked back at the camera. "I don't know what happens next for us," he admitted, "but I know what needs to happen with you and me, Mom. I need to actually show up out loud the next time someone treats you like you don't belong somewhere." "I'd like that," I said. "I've been waiting 11 years to hear it." The call ended a few minutes later, quieter than it began. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time afterward, understanding that whatever came next for Marcus and Vanessa's marriage wasn't something I could fix, or was even meant to. I had only ever been responsible for my own dignity. It had simply taken me 3 years and one very public joke to remember that. Vanessa came to my house on a Thursday afternoon in early July, nearly a month after the party. I hadn't expected her. She stood on my porch holding a small potted plant, an offering that felt, to me, both awkward and strangely honest, as though she hadn't known what else to bring and had grabbed the first thing that seemed appropriately humble. "Can I come in?" she asked. Her voice had none of its usual polish. "You can," I said, and stepped aside. We sat in my living room, the same room where Emma had once fallen asleep on the couch during family movie nights, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally, Vanessa set the plant down on the coffee table and looked at her hands. "I lost 3 friendships over the country club thing," she said quietly. "Turns out people who only know you through a membership card don't stick around once the card's gone." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's probably its own lesson." "It might be," I said. "I've been telling myself for weeks that you overreacted. she continued, that it was just a joke that went too far. But I keep coming back to the fact that I made that joke standing on grass you paid for in front of people whose good opinion mattered more to me than yours ever did. That's not a joke. That's just who I let myself become. I didn't rush to reassure her. I'd spent 3 years rushing to make everyone else comfortable while my own discomfort sat quietly, unacknowledged, in the corner of every room I entered. I wasn't in a hurry to abandon that instinct now that it was finally serving me. "Why did you do it?" I asked instead. "Not that night specifically, all of it, 3 years of it." She was quiet for a long time. "I think I was scared," she said finally. "I grew up watching my parents lose everything that made us feel like we belonged anywhere. I promised myself I'd never let that happen to my kids, and somewhere along the way, I think I started resenting anyone who reminded me that the life I'd built wasn't entirely mine. You reminded me of that every time you wrote a check. I turned that into contempt because contempt felt better than gratitude I didn't know how to give." "Gratitude isn't weakness, Vanessa," I said. "I never once asked you to grovel. I would have settled for being introduced by my actual name." She flinched slightly at that, and I watched her absorb it rather than deflect it, which felt like its own small progress. "I told Bertram Coyle you were help around the house," she said quietly. "Emma told me you remembered that. I've thought about it more than you'd probably guess. I don't even know why I said it that way. I think some part of me needed you to sound smaller than the amount you were giving us because the actual amount frightened me. It made me feel like a child who couldn't take care of her own family." "You were taking care of your family," I said. "You just weren't paying for it. Those are two very different things, and you built an entire identity around confusing them." She nodded slowly, tears gathering but not falling. "I don't know how to undo 3 years of that." "You don't undo it," I told her. "You just stop doing it starting now, and you let the next 3 years look different. That's the only kind of repair that ever actually holds." It was the most honest thing she had said to me in 11 years, and I told her so. "I don't expect you to forgive me today," she said. "I don't think I've earned that yet." "No," I agreed. "You haven't, but this is a start." She sat quietly for a moment longer, turning the potted plant slightly on the coffee table, as though needing something to do with her hands. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Why did you keep paying all those years if it hurt this much? You could have stopped after the first birthday dinner the first time I said something cutting. Why 3 years?" I thought about that honestly before answering. "Because I kept believing the next gathering would be different," I said. "Because Emma's education actually mattered more to me than my own comfort for a long time. And because, if I'm honest, some part of me was afraid that if I stopped paying, I'd lose access to this family entirely, that the money was the only thing keeping me inside the circle. It took that toast in front of 60 people to show me the circle had already stopped, including me, a long time before the money ever left my account." Vanessa's eyes filled again. "That's the saddest thing I've heard all summer," she said quietly, "and I'm the reason it's true." "You're part of the reason," I said. "Marcus is part of it too. I'm part of it for staying quiet as long as I did. Nobody in this gets to be the only villain, Vanessa. That would be too easy for everyone involved." She nodded, wiped her eyes, and stood to leave. At the door she paused. "Emma told me what you offered her. Just her tuition, nothing to do with us." I nodded. "That was the right call," she said quietly. "I don't think I would have made it if I were you." "I know," I said, "and that's exactly why I made it." Dramatic pause. Autumn arrived, and with it a version of my family I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Marcus called every Sunday now, sometimes just to talk, no request attached to the conversation. He told me over one of those calls that he and Vanessa had started meeting with a financial counselor, working through a real budget for the first time in their marriage, one that didn't depend on anyone else quietly filling the gaps. "It's humbling," he admitted. "Turns out we've been living a life that was never fully ours to afford." I don't know why it took losing the country club to see that clearly. He told me more about those sessions over the following months, usually in small pieces, the way people reveal something they're still a little embarrassed about. The counselor, a soft-spoken man named Arthur Feldman who worked out of a modest office above a dry cleaner, had asked them in their first meeting to list every recurring expense in their household. Marcus said Vanessa had gone quiet halfway through the list, staring at the number at the bottom of the page. She kept saying, "This doesn't add up to what we actually make," Marcus told me. And I finally had to say, "It never did, Vanessa. It added up because my mother made up the difference for 3 years and neither of us ever asked her how." Marcus told me during one of those Sunday calls about a conversation he'd had with a coworker not long after the graduation party, a man named Devin who'd sat beside me at the party itself and asked me kind, genuine questions about the accounting firm. Devin asked me how the party went, Marcus said, and I actually told him the truth for once instead of the polished version. I told him my wife had humiliated my mother in front of 60 people and that my mother had responded by canceling 3 years of quiet financial support none of us had ever properly acknowledged. Devin just looked at me and said, "Man, I hope you fixed that fast because that's not a mistake you get to make twice." I asked Marcus how that conversation had felt, hearing it laid out so plainly by someone with no stake in softening it. "Like finally seeing a mirror I'd been avoiding for years," he said. They sold the second car that October, a leased SUV Vanessa had insisted on 2 years earlier, because she'd said at the time, "The other Ashworth mothers all drive something nicer." Marcus began taking the train into the city 3 days a week instead. Vanessa took a part-time position at a design firm downtown, her first paying job since Tyler was born, something she told me, a little sheepishly, she'd resisted for years because she'd convinced herself that not working was itself a kind of status symbol. "Turns out having my own paycheck feels a lot better than I expected," she admitted on the phone one evening. "Nobody can quietly resent me for a paycheck I earned myself." By the following spring, Vanessa had been promoted to lead a small team at the design firm, overseeing residential staging projects for a handful of local realtors. She told me about it almost shyly, the way someone describes an accomplishment they're still not entirely sure they're allowed to be proud of. "It's not glamorous," she said. "It's a lot of measuring rooms and picking paint swatches, but it's mine. Nobody handed it to me, and nobody's quietly paying for it behind the scenes." I told her that sounded like exactly the kind of belonging she'd been chasing at Cedar Hollow all along, and that it was a shame it had taken losing the club to find the real version of it. Emma finished her senior year at Ashworth, graduated with honors in the spring, and was accepted into a state university with a partial academic scholarship that covered more than either of us expected. She called me the day the acceptance letter arrived, breathless with excitement, and the first thing she said was, "Grandma, thank you for believing this semester mattered enough to fund on your own." I told her I hadn't funded a semester. I'd funded her, and that was a very different thing. Vanessa and I didn't become close, not in the way people might hope for in a story like this one. But something shifted between us that continued to shift, slowly, honestly, over the following months. She stopped introducing me as anything other than Emma and Tyler's grandmother. She started, without being asked, bringing something she'd actually made to family dinners instead of the polished, store-bought contributions she used to arrive with. Small things, but small things done consistently are how trust actually gets rebuilt. Grand gestures rarely do it. Marcus, for his part, began sending me a modest check each month, unprompted, toward what he called the years I let you carry alone. I never asked for repayment, and I told him so more than once. He kept sending it anyway. "It's not about the money, Mom," he told me one Sunday. "It's about proving to myself I finally understand what I let you carry." I didn't argue with that. Some lessons need to be paid for, quite literally, before they fully take root. That October, they invited me to Sunday dinner at their house for the first time since the graduation party. A small thing that felt, at the time, larger than it probably should have. I arrived carrying my old casserole dish, the same one Vanessa had once suggested I retire, and set it on the counter without comment. Nobody laughed at it this time. Nobody suggested we order in instead. Emma answered the door before I even knocked, home for the weekend from her first semester at college, and wrapped me in a hug that lifted me half off my feet the way only a college freshman's enthusiasm can. Tyler was next, taller than he'd been in June, already talking about a science fair project he wanted my opinion on. Marcus carried in groceries from the car, and I noticed, without needing to be told, that the vehicle in the driveway was a modest sedan rather than the leased SUV that had replaced it 2 years earlier. Vanessa met me in the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel, and for a moment neither of us quite knew what to say. Then she gestured toward the stove. "I made the chicken myself this time," she said, a little self-consciously. "No caterer. I looked up your recipe online, actually, the one Marcus always talks about from when he was a kid." "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I wanted to," she said. "I think I've spent a long time trying to impress people who were never going to be impressed by anything real. I'd rather learn how to actually cook for my own family." Dinner that evening had none of the performance I'd grown used to at their table over the previous 3 years. Nobody mentioned the club. Nobody described a recent trip in exhaustive detail. Tyler talked about his science fair project, something involving vinegar and baking soda that he explained with far more enthusiasm than the subject strictly required. And Emma described her dorm room and a professor she liked and a friend from her hall who reminded her, she said, "a little of me." Marcus washed dishes afterward while I dried, the two of us falling into a rhythm neither of us had practiced together since he was a teenager helping me close up the kitchen after Gerald's shop classes ran late. "I used to think a good life meant looking like you had one," he said quietly, handing me a plate. "I think I finally understand that a good life is just one where nobody has to pretend." "That's a hard thing to learn," I told him. "I'm glad you learned it before it cost you more than it already did." "It cost us plenty," he said. "But I think we got off cheap, honestly, considering what it could have cost." Nearly a year after that graduation party, I found myself back at Cedar Hollow Country Club, not as a member, but as a guest, invited by Marcus and Vanessa to a small family dinner on the club's more modest indoor terrace, the one reserved for members who wanted a quiet meal rather than a display. Vanessa had let the membership lapse permanently by then, telling me over dinner that she'd realized she didn't miss the club itself nearly as much as she'd expected to. What she missed, she said, was the version of herself she'd tried to become by belonging to it. "Turns out that version wasn't actually very kind," she admitted. "I'd rather be a person Emma respects than a person her friends' parents envy. I think about that graduation party often, the toast, the laughter, the long walk across the lawn to my car. At the time, it felt like the end of something, the end of a family I had spent years quietly holding together with money nobody acknowledged. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the beginning of something else entirely, a family finally built on honesty rather than quiet obligation. I don't regret a single payment I made over those 3 years. Emma's education mattered to me, and it still does. What I regret is how long I let myself believe that being useful was the same thing as being valued. Those two things can look identical from the outside, and it takes real courage to separate them, especially when the people benefiting from the confusion have no incentive to help you see it clearly. Lauren asked me once, not long after everything had settled, whether I was angry that it took a public humiliation to finally push me toward a decision I probably should have made 2 years earlier, quietly, without an audience of 60 people watching. I told her the truth. I was angry for a while. Not at Vanessa, not really, not by the end of it. I was angry at myself for how long I let a category error go uncorrected, mistaking my own silence for patience and my own patience for virtue. There is a version of generosity that is genuinely selfless, and there is a version that is simply self-erasure wearing generosity's clothing. I had been living inside the second version for 3 years, and I hadn't noticed the difference until I was standing in front of 60 strangers being told gently, cheerfully, over a glass of champagne, exactly where I belonged. Real generosity, I've come to believe, doesn't require secrecy to survive, and it certainly doesn't require humiliation as its price of admission. If a family needs you to disappear quietly into the background of your own sacrifice in order to feel comfortable, that discomfort is telling you something important, and it deserves to be listened to, not smoothed over with another silent check. I think of it now the way I used to think about a client's balance sheet that quietly didn't reconcile. You can ignore a discrepancy for a long time if you want to. It never once fixes itself. It only grows quietly in the dark until someone finally turns the light on. Marcus and I talk most Sundays now, the way Lauren always has, and there's an ease between us that hadn't existed since he was a boy. Before Vanessa, before Ashworth Academy, before 11 years of him learning to go quiet whenever the truth might cost him something at home. I don't think that ease came back because of the money. I think it came back because for the first time in a long while, he watched his mother choose herself, plainly, without apology, and something in him finally understood that this was allowed. Sons learn what they're permitted to become partly by watching what their mothers are willing to accept. I had, without meaning to, spent 3 years teaching my son that his mother could be quietly disrespected indefinitely so long as the checks kept clearing. Canceling those payments taught him something entirely different, and it arrived, I think, at exactly the moment he needed to learn it, with Emma about to leave for college and start building whatever kind of family she would one day build herself. Emma still calls me every week from campus, usually walking somewhere between classes, telling me about a professor she likes or a paper she's dreading. She told me last month, almost as an aside, that she'd started noticing the pattern in her own new friend group, the subtle way some people treat kindness as currency rather than character. "I think about that party a lot, Grandma," she said. "Not the bad part, the part where you stood up and didn't yell and just told the truth and then left. I want to be able to do that someday, if I ever need to." Lauren drove down with her husband and their twin boys for Thanksgiving that year, the first time in nearly 3 years that both of my children and all 4 of my grandchildren had been under the same roof at once. She hugged me tightly in the driveway before she'd even brought in the bags, and the first thing she said, quietly, just for me, was, "I'm so proud of you, Mom. I mean that." Watching her set the table alongside Vanessa that afternoon, the two of them working out an easy rhythm neither had managed in years past, I understood something I hadn't quite let myself believe until I saw it happen in front of me. Families don't heal because one dramatic gesture fixes everything at once. They heal in exactly these small, unremarkable moments. Two women who once barely tolerated each other, chopping vegetables side by side, talking about nothing more complicated than how long to roast a turkey. Over dinner, Lauren's husband asked Marcus, innocently enough, how the tuition situation had eventually worked itself out, clearly having heard only pieces of the story secondhand. The table went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that used to precede something painful in that family, before Marcus simply said, "My mother taught all of us something we should have learned years earlier. Generosity isn't the same as an obligation, and respect isn't optional just because somebody's comfortable." Vanessa beside him nodded without flinching and reached over to refill my water glass without being asked, a small gesture that would have meant nothing 3 years earlier and meant everything now. A few weeks after that dinner, a handwritten card arrived in my mailbox, Emma's careful, looping handwriting on the front of the envelope. Inside, she'd written only a few lines. "Grandma, I found out this year what tuition actually costs. Not the number, but the part nobody puts on the invoice. Thank you for paying for my education twice. Once with money, and once by showing me what it looks like to stop paying for people who forget you're a person." I folded that card carefully and placed it in the same wooden box where I kept a small photograph of Gerald standing proudly beside the oak desk he'd built for me all those years ago. I think he would have recognized exactly what she meant, and I think he would have been proud that it was a Whitfield who finally understood it. I still write checks for the people I love. I've simply stopped writing them for people who need me invisible in order to feel superior. There's a difference, and it took a stranger's cruelty wrapped in a joke standing on a lawn I paid for to finally teach me exactly where that line belongs. These days, when I attend a family gathering, I don't wonder whether I'm dressed correctly for the photographs. I've learned that the people worth standing beside will always make room in the picture, and the ones who won't were never really worth the cost of admission in the first place. Gerald used to say that a good ledger only ever tells you the truth if you're willing to actually read it. It took me 3 years, one graduation party, and a single quiet email to a school's business office to finally read mine all the way through. I don't intend to look away from it again. I think, too, about all the years I spent believing that quiet endurance was itself a kind of strength, that a good mother, a good grandmother, simply absorbed whatever indignities family life required of her without ever asking for the ledger to balance in the other direction. I no longer believe that. Endurance without acknowledgement isn't strength. It's simply a slower, quieter kind of erosion, and it costs exactly as much in the end, whether you name it out loud or not. The difference is only in how long you wait to stop paying for it. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do it differently, if given the chance to go back to the week Marcus first called about Ashworth Academy's tuition, knowing everything I know now. I tell them the truth. I would help again, every single time, because helping Emma was never the mistake. The mistake was allowing that help to become invisible, allowing generosity to calcify into an unspoken entitlement nobody ever had to acknowledge or repay with anything more than basic decency. If I could change one thing, it wouldn't be the checks I wrote. It would be the 3 years of silence I kept around them, silence I mistook again and again for grace. I am 66 years old, a widow, a retired accountant, a grandmother who still writes checks for the people she loves, but I am no longer a woman who pays quietly for a seat at a table where someone else decides out loud in front of 60 people whether or not she belongs. That particular version of me stayed behind on that lawn, along with an empty champagne glass and a joke nobody at that party will ever quite forget. I drove home that night as one woman, and I woke up the next morning as another, and I have never once wished myself back into the first one.